June 12, 1970. A car trunk opens in the dark in upstate New York. Inside is the body of William Bentvena, a made man in the Gambino crime family. But Billy Bats, as people on the street called him, was not killed by another family or in a big mob war. No, he was killed for something much simpler, something much more human. He insulted the wrong man, and in the world of La Cosa Nostra, respect is not just expected, it is a matter of life and death. Tonight, we are going to look at the complete story of Billy Bats, from how he moved up in one of New York's most powerful crime. Familiesto, the night that would be the true story behind one of the most famous movie scenes ever. This is a story of loyalty, pride, prison, and what happens when you disrespect someone in the world of crime. But before we go deep into Billy Bats' world, I want to hear from you, Dot. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Are you listening to this as you fall asleep in New York? Or maybe you are relaxing after a long day in London, Tokyo, or Sydney. Put your location and time in the comments. I love seeing our group of people from all over the world who are interested in true crime and mob history. And if you are new here, welcome to the family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these stories that go deep into the lives of gangsters. If you are enjoying this already, show some love with a like. It helps more people find these stories that have not been told. And if you know someone who loves mob history or true crime, share this with them. Now, let's get into the life and death of Billy Bats. To understand the death of Billy Bats, we must first understand his life. And like many mob stories, this one begins in Brooklyn, a place where the American dream and the world of crime were right next to each other, separated only by the moral choices people made and the chances they were given, which were not always fair. William Paul DeVino came into the world on January 19th, but here's where the story gets confusing. As mob stories often do, some people say he was born in 1921. Others say it was 1933. 12-year difference is not just a mistake in the records. It is a symbol of how unclear these men's lives were. In the world of organized crime, facts can be changed. Dates are not always certain. And even something as basic as a birth year can be hidden on purpose or because of messy record-keeping in immigrant neighborhoods. For this story, we will use the timeline that most people agree on, which says Billy Bats was born in the early 1920 South. This would make him a child during the time when alcohol was illegal and a young man growing up right after World War II. This timing is important because it put him in the perfect spot to see the mob's best years and to become successful with it. That he grew up in East Brooklyn during the Great Depression. In the same neighborhoods that would later be home to Henry Hill and many other mobsters. Picture those streets for a moment. Narrow roads with brick apartment buildings, fire escapes going up the sides of the buildings like iron lines. Carts crowded the sidewalks, selling everything from fresh fish to used clothes. The air smelled of garlic, tomato sauce, fresh bread from the corner bakery, and sometimes, especially in summer, garbage that sat for too long in the heat. This was a world that was closed off from others, a place where Italian was spoken as often as English, where old traditions from Italy mixed with new chances in America. The Depression had hit these neighborhoods hard. It was hard to find a real job. Men stood on street corners not because they were lazy, but because the factories were not hiring. Families shared small apartments. Children wore clothes passed down from others, until the clothes literally fell apart. In this kind of place, joining a gang was not just one choice for many young men. It seemed like the only choice. The men in the expensive suits, the ones who always seemed to have money, Even when everyone else was poor, they were respected. They protected the neighborhood. They took care of people. And yes, they lived by their own rules. But in a world where the real rules seemed made to keep poor immigrants poor, that did not seem like such a bad thing. Young Billy DeVino, or Bentvena, as he would later be known, watched these men. He learned the rules of the street before he learned math. Omerta. The rule of silence was not something explained in words. It was learned by watching. You saw who did well and who disappeared. Learned that loyalty was rewarded and being a traitor was punished. You understood that there were certain questions you did not ask and certain things you did not see, even when they happened right in front of you. Being Italian was not just about culture in these groups. It was a rule. La Cosa Nostra. This thing of ours was only for Italians. Both sides of your family had to be Italian for you to be considered a full member. This was not just about being unfair. It was for security. The mob thought that someone with strong Italian roots would be less likely to betray the group and more likely to understand and follow the old traditions. Billy Batts was 100% Italian. This was his ticket to get in. But just being Italian was not enough. You needed more than the right last name to succeed in this world. You needed to be smart, brave, and able to make money. The mob was not a charity. It was a business. And every man had to prove he was worth something. The Brooklyn of Billy's childhood was a training ground, though no one would have called it that. The secret bars during the time alcohol was illegal had been replaced by illegal betting businesses. Social clubs were on the streets, their windows often covered with paper, their back rooms holding card games, where thousands of dollars were won and lost in a single night. Loan sharks worked openly in these neighborhoods, offering money at interest rates that would make today's payday lenders look cheap, but also offering money when banks would not. Protection rackets were common. Business owners paid for insurance, not from fires or theft by regular criminals, but from the very men who were collecting the money. It was a scam. Yes, but it was also real in some ways. If you paid money to the local crew, no one else could bother you. Your store would not get damaged. Thieves knew to look somewhere else. In a strange way. The system worked. Young Billy learned all of this. He ran errands for the older guys. He proved he could keep his mouth shut. He showed he was not afraid of taking risks. Exact details of his early life in crime are lost to time. He was not famous enough yet for the police to watch his every move, and the mob was definitely not keeping written records of what their less important members were doing. But we know he was there. We know he was learning. We know that by the time he was an adult, Billy Batts, the name he would be known by on the streets, had decided his future was not in the normal world of 9-to-5 jobs and small paychecks, but in the world of crime of La Cosa Nostra. This was the 1940s now, and the mob was starting its best years. World War II had just ended. America was doing well. Money was everywhere. And organized crime, which had learned how to make money when alcohol was illegal, was now learning how to make money from peace and good times. There were unions to control, real businesses to get into, betting businesses to grow, and 1,000 other chances for men who knew how to work in the shadows. Billy Batts was ready to take his share. By the late 1950s, Billy Batts had become an associate of the Gambino crime family. This difference, associate versus member, is very important to understanding the mob's structuring in the end. The reasons for Billy's death. An associate is basically a person who works for the mob. You work with them. You make money for them. You might even commit crimes for them. But you are not part of the main group. You are not protected by the same rules. You are useful, and you might be trusted. But you are not family in the way that really matters in La Cosa Nostra. The Gambino family at this time was one of the 5 families that controlled organized crime in New York City. The others were the Bonanno, Colombo, Genovese, and Lucchese families. Together they created the Commission, a group that was meant to solve arguments and stop the kind of open fighting that had troubled organized crime in the past. Each family was set up like a company, but a company that solved its problems with violence. At the top was the boss. The Don under him was the Underboss, his second in command. There was also a consigliere, an advisor who gave advice, but was not in the direct line of command. Below them were the capos, or captains, who each led their own crew. And in each crew were the soldiers, the made men, and below them, the associates. Billy Batts came into this world as an associate, which meant he had to work his way up. The exact things he did in his early days are not all known, but we can get an idea from what we know about mob activities at that time and from the few records we have. Betting was probably a big part of what he did. The mob ran numbers rackets, which were illegal lotteries where people could bet small amounts on 3-digit numbers drawn every day. It does not sound like much, but when you are taking bets from thousands of people across the city, the money adds up. The house always wins, and in this case, the house was La Cosa Nostra. Betting on sports was another way to make a lot of money. This was long before the internet, before apps on your phone could let you place a bet with a few taps. If you wanted to bet on a game, you went to a bookie, and there was a good chance that bookie was either part of or paying the local mob crew. Loan sharking, lending money at very high interest rates, was another main source of mob money. Need $500 to pay rent? Sure, you can borrow it, but you will pay back $600 next week. Asterisk. Cannot pay? The interest adds up, and soon you owe thousands. Cannot pay that? Well, now you are doing favors for the crew, or you are giving up a part of your business. Or worse. Protection rackets, hijackings, corruption in unions. All of this was part of the way things worked. An associate like Billy Batts would have been involved in many activities, always making money, always giving a part of it up to his capo, who gave a part up to the underboss, who gave a share to the boss. It was a pyramid scheme. Except instead of falling apart, it was supported by the threat of violence. But Billy was not just making money. He was building relationships. In the mob. Who you know matters as much as what you do. You need a mentor, someone to speak up for you, someone whose own good name proves you are reliable. You need friends among people at your level, because today's fellow associate might be tomorrow's capo. And you need to avoid making enemies, because in a world where arguments are settled with bullets instead of in court, holding a grudge is deadly. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Billy Batts proved himself. He was reliable. He was good at making money. He understood the rules and followed them. Most importantly, he kept his mouth shut when he was arrested, and every mobster got arrested at some point. He did not work with the police. He served his time, paid his lawyers, and never once thought about becoming an informant. This last point is very important. The biggest threat to La Cosa Nostra was not the police. It was members turning into traitors. The FBI at this time was just beginning to truly understand and go after organized crime. J. Edgar Hoover had famously said for years that the Mafia did not even exist. But by the late 1950s, this was changing. The Appalachian meeting in 1957, where dozens of mob bosses from all over the country were found meeting at a private home in upstate New York, had made it impossible to deny that a national crime group existed. Pressure from the federal government was growing, which made loyalty even more valuable. A man who could stay quiet when questioned, who could serve time without flipping, who understood that omerta was not just a rule, but a way to survive. That man was valuable. That man could be trusted with more responsibility, more knowledge, more power. By 1959, Billy Batts had proven he was worthy. The Gambino family officially brought him on as an associate, a title that meant he was now officially working for them rather than just doing jobs for them sometimes. This was a step up, but it was still not the top of the mountain. There was one more level to reach, one more honor to get. He needed to become a made man. In 1961, William Bentvena became a made man in the Gambino family. This moment changed him from Billy, the associate, into Billy Batts, the soldier. It changed everything. The making ceremony is one of the most secret and special rituals in La Cosa Nostra. Details have come out over the years from informants and secret recordings, but for a long time it was a secret. Based on those stories, we can imagine what Billy's ceremony might have been like. It would have happened in a private place, maybe the back room of a social club or a private home. The windows would be covered. The doors would be locked. Guards would be outside, not just for security, but to make sure this ritual was completely private. Billy would have been brought into a room where several made men were waiting. His sponsor, the one who vouched for him, along with a capo and maybe other high-ranking members. On a table would be a gun and a knife, symbols of the life he was choosing. There might also be a picture of a Catholic saint, because even with all their sins, these men still held on to the Catholic culture they grew up in. A capo would have explained what was about to happen. He would have asked Billy if he understood what it meant to be part of La Cosa Nostra, if he was willing to put the family above everything else, above his own family, above his own life. If he had to, Billy would have said he was willing. Then would come the blood oath. Billy's trigger finger would be pricked with a pin or cut with a knife, drawing blood. A picture of the saint would be placed in his cupped hands and set on fire. Billy would pass the burning picture from hand to hand, never dropping it, while saying an oath. The exact words are different in different stories, but the main point is always the same. May I burn in hell like this. Saint is burning if I betray La Cosa Nostra. The blood was a symbol of the family's willingness to bleed for each other. The fire was a symbol of the never-ending punishment for traitors. Once the oath was done, Billy would be hugged by each man there. He was now their brother. He was now a made man. This ceremony was not just for show. It was a complete change of who he was. From that moment on, Billy Batts was under the protection of La Cosa Nostra. The rules that controlled the mob now applied to him in both ways. He had to follow them, but they also protected him. Most importantly, he could not be killed without clear permission from the family. Boss, this rule was there to stop exactly the kind of mess that would end up taking Billy's life. If every made man could kill every other made man over personal fights, the families would destroy themselves. So the rule was final. You do not touch a made man without permission from the very top. Of course. Rules are only as strong as the people who enforce them. And we will see how breaking this rule led to problems that affected multiple families for years. Billy was told to work under Carmine Fatico, a capo in the Gambino family who ran things in Queens. Fatico's crew was known for being very active and tough, and it was here that Billy Batts met and became friends with a young, rising star named John Gotti. Gotti in the early 1960s was not yet the fancy, well-dressed don who would later become famous. He was a soldier in Fatico's crew. Just a few years after becoming a made man himself, he was ambitious, violent, and charming, qualities that would eventually make him the boss of the entire Gambino family, though that was still many years away. Billy Batts and John Gotti became friends. In the mob. These relationships matter. They are built on trust earned through things you do together, through crimes committed together, through secrets kept and dangers faced as a team. When you know a man will shoot if you shoot, will run if you run, will keep quiet if you are both arrested. That creates a bond stronger than most people feel in their entire lives. This friendship would become important later, because when Billy Batts was murdered, it would not just be any made man who had been killed. It would be John Gotti's friend. And Gotti, even in the 1970s, was not someone whose friends you could kill without consequences. But before that sad event, Billy Batts had years of success ahead of him. He was a full member of one of New York's most powerful crime families. He was making money. He had respect. He had protection. The life of a made man in the early 1960s could be good. You had a high position in your neighborhood. People wanted favors from you. You could walk into restaurants and get the best table. Police officers, many of whom were being paid off, treated you with a cautious respect. But the mob life also came with constant danger, not just from the police, but from the work itself. The very things that made you money could send you to prison or get you killed. And for Billy Batts, it would be his part in one of the mob's most profitable, but also most forbidden businesses that would lead to his first big downfall. Here is one of the big contradictions of La Cosa Nostra. In the middle of the 20th century, the mob officially banned being involved in selling drugs. But many members dealt drugs anyway. The money was just too good to pass up. The official ban made sense for a smart plan. Selling drugs had very harsh federal punishments. While you might go to jail for a few years for taking bets or fighting, drug charges could put you away for decades. The FBI was especially focused on drugs, meaning drug dealers got a lot of attention from the police. And unlike betting or loan sharking, drug dealing created bad news that the mob's political friends could not easily ignore. But the money was unbelievable. We are talking about the early 1960s, when the heroin business was huge in American cities. The drug had been around for decades. But after World War II, its use in America shot up. Addicts needed a dose every day, which meant they were regular customers. The profit was huge. You could buy a kilo for a few $1,000s and sell it for 10 times that after cutting it and selling it. For a made man like Billy Batts, it was too tempting. Sure, the family said no drugs, but everyone knew guys who dealt on the side. As long as you were quiet about it, as long as you did not bring trouble to the family, as long as you gave a share of your money. Many capos looked the other way. In 1962, Billy Batts was arrested with Carmine Galante, another Gambino member who would later become very well known, on charges of smuggling heroin. The details of what they did have been lost over time. Court records from smaller mob trials in the early 1960s were not always kept carefully, and what was kept often focused on the court case, rather than the details of the crime. What we know is that Billy and Galante were caught in a big heroin operation. This was not some street dealer getting caught with a few bags. This was bringing in and selling drugs, kind of operation that involved multiple states, large amounts of drugs, and the kind of organization that only someone connected to organized crime could run. The arrest was a disaster for Billy's mob career. Not only was he facing a long time in federal prison, but he had been caught breaking family rules. If the boss decided to make an example of him, Billy could find himself not just in prison, but dead. Luckily for him, he was not the only one dealing drugs. It was happening so much that the family could not kill everyone involved without getting rid of most of their members. Still, there had to be consequences. The family could not be seen as completely ignoring its own rules. The solution, as it often was, came through the courts. Billy would take his punishment from the federal government, and that would be seen as enough to make up for it to the family doc. Then came another arrest. This one in 1964 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Billy Batts was caught in a drug deal, supposedly working for Joseph Joe the Crow Delvecchio and Ernie Boy Abamonte, both mobsters with long criminal records. The details of this deal are not fully known, but it was enough to get him convicted. The pattern here shows something important about Billy Batts. He was willing to take big risks for big money. Drug dealing, even with the official ban and the harsh legal punishments, offered profits that regular mob activities could not match. A good betting operation might get you a few $1,000s a week. A good drug connection could make you that in a day. But every dollar came with risk. And Billy's risk finally caught up with him. In 1964. He was sentenced to prison. Reports differ on the exact length of his sentence. Some say 6 years. Others say he got 15 years but served less. What is not argued is when he went to prison and when he was released. He went in sometime in 1964 and came out in June 1970. Those 6 years would change everything, not just for Billy, but for the entire world of organized crime in New York. The world he left behind would be very different from the world he returned to. And most importantly, while he was locked away, new people were rising up who did not know him, did not respect him, and did not care about the rules that should have protected him. The Danbury Federal Prison in Connecticut became Billy Batts' home for the next 6 years. Danbury was a medium-security prison built in the 1940s, known for holding white-collar criminals and mobsters. It was not maximum security. It was not a place like Marion or Leavenworth, but it was still prison, still a place where your freedom was gone and your life was controlled by guards and rules. For a made man, prison was a special experience. You were not just another prisoner. The mob's power reached inside the prison. Other Italian prisoners, especially those with mob connections, would show you respect. You might get better jobs inside the prison, like kitchen work instead of laundry. For example, you could get packages from outside that other prisoners could not. Money could still come in, and with money came special treatment. But no amount of special treatment could change the basic fact: Billy Batts was locked in a cage. He was in his 40s now, middle-aged, and he was spending what should have been his best money-making years in a federal prison. The days in Danbury followed a schedule. Wake up, call at 6 o'clock in the morning. Breakfast in a big dining hall. Work assignments. Billy might have worked in the prison factory or taken care of the grounds. Lunch, more work, dinner. A few hours of free time in the yard or in the shared areas. Locked in a cell at night. Letters became very important. Talking to the outside world was limited to letters and sometimes visits. Billy's family, his wife, his children would write to him, fellow mobsters, careful about what they put in writing, but still wanting to stay in touch, would send short notes. The letters were all read by prison workers, so you learned to write in code, to say things that sounded normal to guards, but had meaning to those who understood the life. Visits were wonderful, but painful. Your family comes to see you, but you are separated by glass or a screen. You cannot hug them properly. You cannot be a real father to your children, or a real husband to your wife. You are there, but not there. Close, but so far away. The years passed slowly. 1964 became 1965. The Beatles were the biggest band on the radio. America's part in the Vietnam War was getting bigger. The country was changing. Culture was changing. And Billy Batts was missing all of it, watching the world change through letters and short news reports. 1966 arrived. John Gotti, his friend from Fatico's crew, was still on the streets. The Gambino family was doing very well. Carlo Gambino, the boss, had taken full control and was running the family with a firm but gentle hand. Quiet, smart, deadly, and efficient. By 1967, new people were showing up in the mob world. Younger guys in their 20s and 30s were moving up in the ranks. These were men who had not fought in World War II, who had grown up in the fairly good times of the 1950s, who had different ideas about violence and respect. The older guys talked about honor and rules. These young guys were more wild, more willing to ignore tradition if it helped them. One of those young guys was Tommy DeSimone. DeSimone was an associate of the Lucchese family. Not Gambino, but the families all worked in the same areas, especially in Queens. Tommy had a reputation even then. He was violent. He was crazy. He was the kind of guy who would kill over nothing if he thought you insulted him, gave him a bad look, or disrespected him for a moment. According to the stories that would later come out, Tommy DeSimone had killed multiple people before he was 25. These were not all approved killings for the family. Some were just Tommy being Tommy. Explosive, unpredictable, deadly. Billy Bats, locked in Danbury, did not know Tommy DeSimone. He might have heard the name in letters or from other prisoners with mob connections, but they had never met. They were in different groups, different families, different crews, different generations. This would turn out to be deadly. By 1968. Billy had served 4 years, with 2 more to go. The prison routine continued. The world outside kept changing. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago turned into a riot. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. Robert Kennedy was killed. The country seemed to be falling apart. In the mob world, pressure from the police was growing. The FBI had created special teams to fight organized crime. They were using new ways to investigate, like long-term watching, secret recordings, and looking at financial records. The days of the mob working almost without any consequences were slowly ending, though it would take another 10 years before RICO charges would truly destroy La Cosa Nostra. 1969 arrived. Billy Bats was now in his 6th year in prison. His release date was getting closer. He could taste freedom. He started thinking about what he would do when he got out. See old friends again. Get back into his work. Make money again. Get his status back on the streets. He had missed 6 years of his life. 6 years away from his family. 6 years of other guys making money while he sat in a cell. 6 years of the world changing without him. But he was still a made man. He was still protected by the rules. He was still a member in good standing of the Gambino family. His friend John Gotti was still out there. The life was waiting for him. In June 1970, after serving about 6 years, Billy Bats was released from Danbury. He walked out of those gates a free man. The sun was brighter than he remembered. The air smelled different. Everything seemed amazing and wonderful. He had survived prison. He had stayed silent. He had followed the code. Now he was going home. He had no way of knowing he had just 3 days left to. Live, June 9th, 1970. Billy Bats walked out of the Danbury Federal Prison and back into the world. He was 49 years old if we go with the 1921 birthday, or younger if we believe the 1933 date. Either way, he had spent his middle years in prison and was now coming out into a world that had changed a lot. The first moments of freedom after years in prison are powerful. Colors seem brighter. Sounds are sharper. The simple act of walking down the street without guards, without fences, without being told what to do. It is amazing, you can go left or right just because you want to. You can stop and buy a coffee. You can breathe air that does not smell like cleaning supplies and being trapped. Billy's family was there to meet him. Imagine their reunion. His wife, his children, all older now, all changed by the years he had been away. There would have been tears, hugs, and a lot of emotion. You try to make up for lost time in those first moments, even though you know you never really can. But Billy Batts was not just returning to his family. He was returning to the life. And in the mob, coming home from prison is a big deal. You have proven your loyalty by doing time without helping the police. You have followed Omerta. You have kept the faith. This should be recognized and celebrated. Got the news spread quickly through the crew. Billy Batts is home. The older guys who knew him from before would want to see him again. Friends like John Gotti would want to see him. The bosses would want to welcome him back. To make sure he understood his place in the group now, to give him chances to start making money again, a welcome home party was planned. This is a tradition in mob culture. When a good guy comes home from prison, you throw him a party that it is part celebration, part business meeting, part showing respect that you are showing the man coming back that he was not forgotten, that his sacrifice was valued, that he is still part of the family. The place chosen was Robert's Lounge, a bar in Queens. Now, here is an interesting detail. Robert's Lounge was not a Gambino place. It was owned by Jimmy Burke, who was connected to the Lucchese family. But the mob families, while they competed, were not completely separate. They did business together, hung out together, and in a place like Queens, where multiple families worked, you would often have gatherings with people from different families. Robert's Lounge was a typical mob hangout. From the outside, it looked like a regular bar. A neon sign, dark windows, maybe a little old, but nothing that would get special attention. Inside, though, it was clearly a place for mobsters. The bartender knew to give certain customers free drinks. There were tables in the back where serious talks happened. The jukebox played Italian classics, along with popular songs of the day. The place was owned by James, Jimmy the Gent, Burke, though owned might be too strong a word. Like many mob places, who actually owned it was kept unclear to avoid losing it. To the government, Jimmy Burke was a famous person in the world of crime, known for the Lufthansa heist. That would happen later in the decade for being a go-between and seller of stolen goods. Burke was an interesting person. He was Irish, which meant he could never be a made man in the Italian Mafia. The rule about being Italian was final, but he was so good at what he did, so valuable, that the Lucchese family kept him as a high-level associate. He had his own crew. He ran big operations, and he was truly respected, even though he could never take the blood oath. The party for Billy Batts was set for late June, giving him a couple of weeks to settle in, see his family, and get used to the neighborhood again. During those first days of freedom, Billy would have walked the streets he had been away from for 6 years. The neighborhood would be familiar, but different. Some businesses closed, new ones opened. People got older, children grew up, old faces were gone. He would stop at the social clubs where mobsters gathered. The older guys would hug him, pat his back, ask about prison, and share stories about what had happened while he was away. Younger guys would be introduced to him, and he would check them out, trying to figure out the new order of things. Who was rising? Who was falling? Where he fit in. Now, the world had changed. Fashion had changed. Billy's clothes from before prison probably looked old now. Music had changed. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones had changed rock music. Politics had changed. The Vietnam War was all over the news. Protests filled the streets. Even the mob had changed. The old certainties were disappearing as the police used new methods. But some things stayed the same. The code was still the code. Made men were still protected. Respect was still the most important thing on the streets. And Billy Batts was. still a respected member of the Gambino family, with all the protections and special treatment that came with it, Doc, or so he thought, during those first days of freedom. Somewhere in Queens, a young troublemaker named Tommy DeSimone was living his life. Tommy was working for Jimmy Burke, running different criminal businesses, making money, and holding on to a violent temper that had already gotten multiple people killed. Tommy did not know Billy Batts. He might have heard the name, but they had never met. They were in different groups, different families, different generations, different neighborhoods. Normally, they might have stayed strangers their whole lives, but the welcome home party was being held at Robert's Lounge, Tommy's hangout, Jimmy's place, and Tommy would be there, along with another young associate named Henry Hill, who would later become famous for his testimony and for the book and movie based on his life. The stage was being set for a sad event that will be remembered in mob history. To understand what happened at Robert's Lounge, we need to understand the men who would be there that night. This was not just a random group of criminals. Each person there had a specific role in the world of organized crime. And the way they interacted would decide how the evening went. First, let's talk about Thomas DeSimone. Tommy was born in 1950, which made him just 20 years old when Billy Batts came home from prison. He was young, but in the mob, age does not always equal danger. In fact, young mobsters could be more dangerous than older ones because they were trying to prove themselves, trying to build their reputations, and often did not have the self-control that comes with getting older. Tommy was about 6'12", tall and weighed around 225 pounds. He was a big man who looked scary, with a violent side that showed up early in his criminal life. According to different stories that would come out later, Tommy had already killed multiple people by age 20. These were not careful, planned mob killings. Many were sudden acts of violence caused by small things that bothered him. One famous story about Tommy, told in Nicholas Pileggi's book, Wise Guy, was about him shooting a young man named Spider in a bar, simply because the kid did not get drinks fast enough. This was not business. This was not an approved killing. This was just Tommy being Tommy. Explosive, deadly, unpredictable. He desperately wanted to become a made man. Being Italian was not enough. You needed to prove you were worthy. You needed to commit murders for the family. You needed to show complete loyalty and skill. Tommy wanted that recognition desperately. He wanted the respect, the protection, the status that came with being made. But there was a problem. Tommy's reputation. Yes, he was feared, but he was also seen as not stable. The mob valued violence, but controlled violence. A soldier who killed when ordered was valuable. Person who killed on a whim was a problem. Tommy was the second one. And people in the know whispered that he might never be made because he could not be trusted with it. This frustration, this desperation for respect and recognition, made Tommy like a bomb ready to explode. He was always on edge, always ready to feel disrespected, always ready to respond with violence. And importantly, he did not fully understand or care about the rules that mobsters followed when they interacted. To Tommy, respect was immediate and personal. He did not think about bigger consequences or family politics. Then there was James Jimmy the Gent Burke. Born in 1931. Jimmy was almost 40 when Billy Batts was released. He had spent his whole adult life in crime and had become one of the most successful criminals in New York, even though he could not be a full mob member because he was Irish. Jimmy was called the Gent, supposedly because he gave big tips, though this gentlemanly reputation hid a mean person inside. He was smart, much smarter than Tommy. He understood the game, understood politics, understood when to be patient and when to act. He built his reputation on hijackings. selling stolen goods and planning complex criminal activities. Burke had his own crew, and Tommy DeSimone was part of it. So was Henry Hill. The third key person in our story. Henry was born in 1943, making him 27 in 1970. Unlike Tommy, and unlike Jimmy, Henry was only half Italian. His father was Irish. This mixed background meant Henry, like Jimmy, could never be made. But he had been involved in mob life since he was a teenager, growing up across the street from a mob social club in Brooklyn, slowly getting pulled into the life. Henry was the one who told this story. Years later, after he became a witness for the government, his testimony and his stories would be the basis for the book Wise Guy and the movie Goodfellas. Every detail we know about what happened to Billy Batts comes through Henry Hill's memoriam. His need as a witness to tell the prosecutors what they wanted to hear. This is important to remember. We are getting this story from someone who was deeply involved and not completely. Trustworthy. Henry had every reason to make his own. Parts seemed smaller, and the parts of others seemed bigger. He had every reason to make the story dramatic, memorable, and easy to prosecute. That does not mean he lied, but it means we should know that his story, while detailed, comes from someone with a very specific viewpoint and reason for telling it. Henry describes himself as somewhat separate from the extreme violence of Tommy and Jimmy. He was a moneymaker, a helper, someone who made money for the crew through different scams and plans. He was not a killer by nature, though he was certainly willing to be involved in murders and to help get rid of bodies. In mob terms, he was a moneymaker rather than an enforcer. These three men, Tommy, Jimmy, and Henry, were part of the Lucchese family circle, working in Queens, running different criminal businesses. They hung out at Robert's Lounge, which was their headquarters and social spot. It was their territory, their safe place, their home base. And this is where Billy Batts' welcome home party was being held. Now, why would a Gambino-made man have his welcome home party at a Lucchese-connected place? The answer is in the complicated geography and relationships of the mob. Queens was a kind of borderland, with multiple families working in areas that overlapped. Business relationships crossed family lines all the time. Jimmy Burke, even though he was connected to the Lucchese family, did business with Gambino guys, Colombo guys, whoever was making money. Also, Robert's Lounge was known as a good place for parties. It had the right feel, the right location, and Jimmy was a good host when it was good for him. Having a Gambino made man celebrate. They made the lounge's reputation as a neutral, respected gathering place even better. So the party was planned. Billy Batts would be the guest of honor. Friends from the Gambino family would come, and as was normal at mob social events, guys from other families who knew Billy or who had business relationships with the Gambino crew would also show up to pay their respects. This included the young guys who hung out at Robert's regularly, Tommy, Henry, and others from Jimmy's crew. In a normal world, this would be fine. Different mob families hung out together, socially all the time. The rules for how to behave at such events were well understood. You were polite. You showed respect. To made men especially, you kept any personal fights or business disagreements away. These were special. Places where the usual tensions were put aside for friendship and celebration. But as we will see, these rules only work when everyone there understands and respects them. And Tommy DeSimone, young, explosive, and desperate for respect he had not earned, was about to prove that he understood nothing. According to Henry Hill's later testimony, Billy Batts enjoyed 2 weeks of freedom before the terrible night. 2 weeks to see his family again, walk the streets as a free man, go to the welcome home party, and get back to normal life. Or at least as normal as mob life ever got. The evening started normally enough. Robert's Lounge filled with people. Music played from the jukebox, probably a mix of Italian classics and popular songs. Drinks were served. Cigarette smoke filled the air, creating a hazy feel that was typical of bars at that time. The smell would have been unique. Alcohol, tobacco, cologne, and the specific smell of too many people in a small space. Billy Batts arrived as the guest of honor. He would have been greeted warmly with hugs and handshakes, pats on the back, and real happiness at seeing him free. In mob culture, these greetings are not just polite. They are rituals that show who is in charge and who belongs. How you are greeted tells everyone there where you stand in the order of importance. As a made man in the Gambino family, Billy would have been greeted with special respect by everyone there, especially the younger associates. Even though this was a Lucchese-connected place, the rules were clear. Made men from any family deserved respect from associates who were not made, no matter which family the associates were connected to. Tommy DeSimone was at the bar when Billy Batts arrived. According to Henry Hill, Tommy and Billy had some kind of past together, though the details are not clear. The key point was this: at some point in the past, maybe many years earlier, Tommy had worked as a shoeshine boy. This was before his mob career. Back when he was just a kid trying to make money on the streets. Working as a shoeshine boy was not strange for poor Italian-American kids. At that time, it was honest work, though low-status work, but it was also the kind of normal past that young mobsters wanted to forget once they entered the life. The mob was supposed to be about respect, power, money, not about kneeling at someone's feet to polish their shoes. Billy Batts, seeing Tommy across the bar, apparently recognized him. And here is where stories are a little different on the exact order of events. But the main confrontation is well known. Billy called out to Tommy, made a comment about shining shoes, and asked, according to the most famous version, if Tommy still shined shoes, or told him to go home and get your shine box. The exact words might be lost to time, made more dramatic by years of retelling. But the point is clear. Billy Batts publicly reminded Tommy DeSimone of his humble past in front of other mobsters in a way that was meant to be embarrassing. Now, let's stop and look at this moment, because it is very important to understanding everything that happened next. From Billy Batts' point of view, this was probably just joking around and teasing. Mob culture, especially Italian-American mob culture, involves a lot of casual insults and teasing. Guys constantly make fun of each other, test each other, push the limits. It is how you show you are comfortable with each other and set up social relationships. If you can take a joke, you are strong. If you can give it back, you are respected. Billy was also a made man talking to Ann, associate in the mob hierarchy. This gave him the right to say pretty much anything he wanted. Associates were supposed to take disrespect from made men without responding. It was part of the power structure. Plus, Billy had just spent 6 years in prison. He was feeling good, feeling free, probably drinking, and definitely enjoying being the center of attention. A little teasing of a young troublemaker probably seemed harmless. Just another way to show his status at his own welcome home party. But from Tommy DeSimone's point of view, this was disrespect he could not stand. He was being embarrassed in front of his friends, reminded of a past he wanted to forget, treated like he was nothing by someone who had been away for 6 years and did not know how dangerous Tommy had become. Tommy's reputation was built on violence and on never accepting disrespect. When someone crossed him, Tommy responded with his fists or his gun. That is what made him feared. That is what made him valuable to Jimmy, Burke's crew. His willingness to explode at any moment kept people careful around him. But Billy Batts was a made man. Tommy could not just respond the way he normally would. The rules were final. You do not touch a made man, ever. not without permission from that man's boss. Permission that would never be given for something as small as an insult at a party dot. So, Tommy did something unusual for him. He controlled himself. According to Hill's story, Tommy's face went red. He was clearly very angry, but he did not attack right away. He took the insult. He let it sit. The party continued. More drinks, more conversation, more celebrating Billy Bat's return. But the tension was there now, hanging in the air like the cigarette smoke. The guys who knew Tommy, especially Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke, knew that look on his face. They knew he was furious. They knew this was not over. Billy Batts, from all reports, did not notice or did not care. He continued enjoying his party, probably made a few more comments to Tommy or about Tommy Dot in his mind. He had put a young associate in his place. This was normal. This was how things worked, Dot, except it was not how things worked anymore. The old rules, the ones that said you took disrespect from made men, because that was the order of things, and the order of things was special. Those rules were fading. Young guys like Tommy did not have the same respect for tradition. They did not have the patience to wait for years for respect. They wanted it now, and they were willing to kill for it, Dot, as the night went on. Tommy, Jimmy, and Henry had a conversation. We do not know the exact words, but we know what they decided. Dot, they decided Billy Batts had to die. Dot, think about that decision for a moment. They were going to kill a made man. Not just any made man, but a Gambino family member, a friend of John Gotti, someone with serious connections, because he had made jokes about shining shoes. Dot, this was not a smart decision. This was not good mob business. This was ego, anger, and stupidity all wrapped up in a moment of group madness. Jimmy Burke should have known better. He was older, more experienced, more thoughtful, but maybe he was tired of Billy's comments. 2. Or maybe he just went along with Tommy, because saying no to Tommy when he was in that kind of mood was dangerous. Even for Jimmy Henry Hill, for his part, was the lowest ranking of the three. If Tommy and Jimmy decided someone had to die, Henry's job was to help, not to question. The plan was made quickly. They would wait until Billy was ready to leave, until the party was ending and there were fewer people to see. Then they would act. Billy Batts, celebrating his freedom, surrounded by friends and associates, enjoying drinks and conversation, had no idea that in the next few hours he would be dead. His belief in the rules that protected him, his confidence in his status as a made man, his inability to see how unstable Tommy DeSimone was, all of this would be deadly. The party continued, the music played, the drinks flowed, and 3 men waited for their moment to commit a murder that would break every rule of La Cosa Nostra, start a chain of events that would play out for years. Henry Hill's later testimony gives the most detailed story of what happened next. Though, as always, we must remember that this is one man's memory changed by time, trauma, and the needs of prosecutors building a case. According to Hill, the moment came late in the evening. Billy Batts was ready to leave. He had been drinking for hours, celebrating, enjoying his welcome home party. He was relaxed, not on guard. Happy as he walked toward the door. Tommy DeSimone made his move. What happened next was sudden and brutal. Tommy attacked Billy with a gun, not shooting him, but using the weapon as a club, hitting him over and over with the gun with wild anger. The attack was so fast, so unexpected, that Billy barely had time to react. One moment he was walking toward the door. The next he was being beaten to the ground. Jimmy Burke joined in almost immediately. 2 men, both large and strong, were now beating Billy Batts. The sounds would have been horrible. The thud of metal and fists against skin and bone. Billy's cries of pain and confusion. The grunts of his attackers. Henry Hill's role, by his own account, was to stand watch. Make sure no one walked in on the attack. Make sure the scene stayed private. This was not very brave, but it was still being involved. He was part of the murder crew, even if he was not throwing punches. The beating was vicious. Billy Batts, just 3 days out of prison, after 6 years of being locked up, was being murdered in the bar that had hosted his welcome home party. The meaning is almost too sad. The celebration of freedom became the location of death. When they finally stopped, Billy Batts lay still on the floor. Blood pooled around him. His face was a mess. He was not moving, not making sounds. By all looks, he was dead. Now came the real problem. What to do with a dead body in the middle of a bar? This is where experience mattered. Jimmy Burke had dealt with dead bodies before. He knew you could not just leave a body in your own place. It was asking for a murder charge. You had to move it, get rid of it, make it disappear. The mob had been hiding bodies for decades. There were ways to do this. Even if those ways were grim, they wrapped Billy's body in tablecloths. The same kind of tablecloths that would have been on the tables during his welcome home party. There is something especially cruel about this detail. Though it was probably just practical, tablecloths are large. They soak up liquid, and they were right there. The wrapped body was carried to a car. Stories differ on whose car, but it was likely one of the cars parked outside the lounge. They placed Billy's body in the trunk, closed the lid, and suddenly the immediate problem was handled. The body was contained, hidden, ready to be moved. The plan was to take Billy to a place upstate where they could bury him properly. Jimmy. Burke had a friend who owned a dog kennel in a country area. It was the perfect place to get rid of a body. Far away, private, with ground that could be dug without anyone noticing. Dog kennels, after all, were places where things got buried regularly, but they could not leave right away. First, they had to clean up the scene in Robert's lounge. Blood had to be mopped up. Evidence had to be removed, and everything had to look normal in case police came around asking questions. It is worth thinking about the mindset of this moment. They had just killed a made man. A huge breaking of mob rules. The punishment for this, if found out, would be death for all of them. Not a quick death either, but the kind of death the mob saved for traitors. Torture, suffering. A message sent to anyone else who might think about breaking the rules. Yet, they were going ahead with it anyway. Maybe the excitement was too high to think clearly. Maybe they believed they could keep it a secret. Maybe, in Tommy's case at least, he simply did not care about the consequences. He had been disrespected, and he had responded the only way he knew how. Henry Hill later described what happened after mob murders as strange. Your heart is pounding, your hands are shaking, but you go through the motions. Clean up, get rid of evidence, prepare to lie. You are acting on instinct, driven by the knowledge that if you do not do everything right, you are the next one in a trunk. Once the first cleanup was done, it was time to move Billy's body. Henry and Jimmy got in one car. Tommy followed in another car. This separation was smart, giving a backup in case one car was stopped by police or broke down. The drive from Queens to upstate New York would take several hours, especially at night when you had to be careful about speed limits and avoiding any attention from police. The last thing you wanted was to get pulled over for a broken taillight when you had a dead body in your trunk. Imagine that drive. Headlights cutting through the dark, the hum of the engine, the weight of what they had done sitting on them. Henry, not a natural killer, must have been terrified. Jimmy, more experienced with violence, was probably thinking of all the ways this could go wrong. Tommy, in the other car, was perhaps still buzzing with anger and excitement, and in the trunk, wrapped in tablecloths, was Billy Batts, a man who had survived 6 years in federal prison, only to be murdered 3 days after his release, killed for the crime of insulting the wrong person. They drove north, leaving the city behind. The city view changed to suburbs, then to country roads. Trees lined the highways. The darkness was deeper here, away from the city lights. Small towns flashed by, their people sleeping, completely unaware that a murder victim was being moved through their towns. The drive must have felt like it would never end. Every set of headlights behind them would have brought a jolt of fear. Was it a cop? Was it someone following them? Every traffic light was a moment of being exposed, sitting in the open with a body in the trunk. But they made it. After hours of driving, they reached the dog kennel owned by Jimmy's friend Dot. It was far enough away that they could do what needed to be done without anyone watching. The property was dark, quiet, alone, perfect for their needs. They parked the cars and got out. The night air would have been cooler up here, away from the city heat. Crickets chirped. Maybe a dog from the kennel barked in the distance. Tommy went to open the trunk. Time to get the body out, dig a grave, bury Billy Bats, and finish this nightmare. The trunk lid lifted. And then they heard it. A sound, a moan, movement. Billy Bats was still alive. Let's go back and imagine what Billy Bats must have felt in that trunk. Because his suffering should be recognized, even in a story full of violence. The beating had been strong enough to knock him out and make him look dead. He likely had a concussion, maybe with a broken skull, and definitely with huge damage to his face. He would have lost a lot of blood. In a hospital, he would have needed surgery right away, blood and intensive care. But he was not in a hospital. He was wrapped in tablecloths and locked in a car trunk at some point during the drive, and we do not know when Billy woke up. Imagine the horror of that moment. You wake up in complete darkness. You are wrapped in fabric, unable to move properly. Your face is a mess. Blood is dried around your nose and mouth, making it hard to breathe. Your head is pounding. You try to remember what happened, but the memories are in pieces. A party, being hit, pain, then nothing. You try to move and realize you are in a small space. The movement under you tells you you are in a car. The vibrations, the sound of the engine, the occasional bump as the car hits a pothole or a rough part of the road. And then you remember DeSimone, the beating. Oh God, you are in the trunk of a car, and the men who put you here think you are dead. Billy Bats, even with his injuries, began trying to make noise, moaning, maybe kicking at the trunk lid. He was fighting for his life in the most real way, trying to let someone, anyone, know that he was alive, that he needed help, that this nightmare needed to end. But the only people who could hear him were his killers. From the point of view of Jimmy, Burke and Henry Hill in the front car, the drive had been tense, but okay. They were getting away from the crime scene. Soon they would bury the body, and then it would just be a matter of keeping quiet. Billy Bats would become another missing person, another mob mystery that would never be officially solved. They had probably been telling themselves that they would get away with it. Yes, they had killed a made man, a huge breaking of mob rules. But if no one knew, if the body was never found, maybe they could survive this. Maybe the Gambino family would search for Billy, but without a body, without people to testify, the search would go nowhere. These thoughts were shattered the moment they opened the trunk and heard Billy Bats moaning. The scene that happened at that dog kennel in upstate New York was like something from a nightmare. The trunk lid opened, and there was Billy Bats, beaten, bloody, broken, but alive. His eyes might have been swollen shut. His face would have been impossible to recognize, but he was awake enough to move, to make sounds, to know what was happening to him. Did he beg for his life? Did he try to make a deal, to promise he would be silent, to ask for any bit of mercy from his killers? We do not know. Henry Hill's testimony never gave those details, and maybe that is a good thing. What we do know is that Tommy DeSimone and Jimmy Burke knew they had to finish what they had started. Man who survives a murder attempt becomes a witness. Billy Batts, if he somehow got away or got help, would name his attackers. The only way forward was to make sure he did not survive. According to Hill's testimony, Tommy and Jimmy pulled Billy from the trunk dot, then they beat him again. This time with a shovel and a tire iron, tools that happened to be there. Turned into murder weapons. This was not the sudden explosion of violence that had happened at Robert's lounge. This was a planned, deliberate killing. They knew he was alive. They knew what they were doing, and they did it anyway, hitting him over and over until there was no chance of him living. The meanness is almost impossible to understand, but it also shows the desperation they must have felt. Their first attempt at the bar had failed. Now they were all the way in, committed to a plan that would change the rest of their lives. When Billy Batts finally stopped moving, when there were no more sounds, no more signs of life, they knew he was truly dead this time. The man who had walked out of federal prison just 3 days earlier was now a dead body in upstate New York, hundreds of miles from home. They dug a grave on the property. The dog kennel owner, Jimmy's friend, either helped or looked the other way. Either way, he was now part of a murder, tied to the secret by his own involvement. The grave did not need to be deep or fancy. It just needed to hide a body. They rolled Billy into the hole and began covering him with dirt, shovel by shovel. They buried him in a grave with no marker that his family would never find, in a place no one would think to search. When the grave was filled and the dirt packed down, they stood looking at what they had done. 3 men tied together by murder. 3 men who had broken the most important rules of La Cosa Nostra. 3 men who would have to keep the secret for the rest of their lives, knowing that if the truth came out, the punishment would be death. They had killed Billy Batts twice, once at Robert's lounge and once at the dog kennel. The second murder was worse because it was done knowingly, on purpose, and with no reason other than to cover up the first murder. They cleaned themselves up as best they could, got back in their cars, and drove back to Queens, leaving Billy Batts in the ground. The sun was probably coming up by the time they got back to the city. A new day was starting, life going on for them, while Billy Batts lay cold in a grave with no marker. They would have to act normal now, go about their daily lives, pretend nothing had happened, and above all, they would have to hope that no one found out what they had done. Right after the murder of Billy Batts, Tommy DeSimone, Jimmy Burke, and Henry Hill promised each other to keep it a secret. This was more than just a deal between criminals in the mob world. Keeping quiet about a murder, especially one that broke family rules, was literally a matter of life and death. The first problem was Billy's disappearance. When a made man goes missing, people notice. His family would be looking for him. His crew would be asking questions. His friends, including John Gotti, would want to know where he was. The first story, we can guess, was that Billy had left the party and no one knew where he had gone. Maybe he was with a woman. Maybe he had gone to visit family in another state. Maybe he was just enjoying his freedom, traveling around, doing the things a man does after 6 years in prison. For a few days, maybe even a week or 2, this might have worked. Billy Batts did not have to tell everyone where he was. He had just gotten out of prison now. It was not strange that he would want some time to himself. But as days turned into weeks, the excuses did not work anymore. Doc Billy was not the type to just disappear. He had responsibilities, connections. People who depended on him. The Gambino family began to investigate. This is where the story gets confusing, with different stories of how the truth was found out. One idea involves Paul Vario, a Lucchese family capo who was Jimmy Burke's boss. Vari, or supposedly found out about the murder through his contacts. Perhaps Tommy bragged about it. Or perhaps Henry Hill let something slip. Or perhaps Vario simply put together the clues of Billy's disappearance, happening after his visit to Robert's lounge. There is also a more shocking theory involving Karen Hill, Henry's wife. According to some stories, Karen had an affair with Paul Vario. In this version. Tommy DeSimone had at some point tried to attack Karen, and she told Vario about it. Vario, angry at Tommy for this act against the wife of one of his associates, supposedly used the information about Billy Bat's murder to get back at him, or as a threat, telling the Gambino family what had happened. The truth is probably less dramatic and more simple. Too many people knew, or thought they knew, what had happened. Robert's lounge was not empty when Billy was killed. Other mobsters were there, saw the fight, maybe saw some of what happened after. In the mob world, secrets have a way of spreading, especially secrets this big. However it happened, the Gambino family found out that Billy Bats had been murdered by Tommy DeSimone and Jimmy Burke, with Henry Hill's help. This information would have gone up the line of command to the family leaders. The reaction was anger. Billy Bats had been a made man, a respected member of the family, a friend to powerful people, including John Gotti. His murder was not just a crime. It was an insult to the entire Gambino family. The fact that it had been done by associates from the Lucchese's family over something as small as an insult about shining shoes made it even worse. The rules were clear. Tommy DeSimone, Jimmy Burke, and Henry Hill had to die. The question was when and how. The mob does not always act quickly for revenge. Sometimes it is better to wait, to let the targets relax, to make them think they have gotten away with it. A quick killing might start a war between families. A patient, planned revenge keeps the peace while still getting justice. Mob justice anyway. Meanwhile, the FBI was also investigating. Billy Bat's disappearance had been reported, and federal agents were asking questions. The body had not been found, but the situation was suspicious. A made man does not just disappear 3 days after being released from prison. The FBI had been focusing more on organized crime throughout the 1960s, the days of J. Edgar Hoover. Saying the Mafia did not exist were long over. Now there were special, organized crime units, secret recordings, watching, and a growing group of informants. But without a body, without people willing to testify, there was not much the FBI could do. Billy Bats was officially a missing person, and while agents thought a crime had happened, thinking is not proof. The body stayed buried at the dog kennel for years. Tommy, Jimmy, and Henry tried to go on with their lives, tried to act normal, tried to forget what they had done. But that kind of secret does not stay buried forever. At least not in a figurative way, even when the actual body stays buried literally. Tommy DeSimone continued his life in crime, continuing to build his reputation as a dangerous, unpredictable enforcer. But he also knew somewhere in the back of his mind that his days might be numbered. The Gambino family did not forget, and they did not forgive. Jimmy Burke kept running his businesses, kept making money, kept his position in the Lucchese family. But he also knew what he had done, knew the risk he had taken, knew that killing a made man from another family was a death sentence if the wrong people decided to carry it out. Henry Hill, maybe the most worried of the three, lived with the knowledge that he had been part of a murder that broke every rule of the mob. He was not as directly guilty as Tommy and Jimmy. He had stood watch rather than actually hitting Billy, but he was involved. And in mob justice, that was enough. Years passed. The murder of Billy Bats became one more unsolved mystery in the long, bloody history of organized crime in New York. But the wheels of mob justice were turning slowly but surely. Tommy DeSimone disappeared on January 14, 1979, almost 9 years after the murder of Billy Bats. The timing was not by chance. The mob has a long memory, Doc, according to different stories. Tommy was told he was going to be made, finally promoted to a full member of the Lucchese family. This was everything he had wanted. The recognition and respect he had been chasing his whole criminal life. He had killed for it. He had waited for it. And now it was finally happening. Or so he thought. The ceremony was a trap. The details are not clear because no one who was there has ever publicly said what happened. But the general story is, accepted by mob historians and the police. Tommy was tricked into going to a place by being told he was being made, and instead he was murdered. This is a classic mob killing technique. You use the victim's own desires against him. Tommy wanted to be made so desperately that he walked into the trap without any suspicion. He probably dressed up for the event, probably felt proud and excited. He was finally going to take the blood oath, finally going to become untouchable. Instead, he was killed. The way he was killed is not known for sure, but mob killings typically involve gunshots to the head. Tommy's body was never found, which is a normal thing for the mob to do when they want to send a specific message. You broke our rules so completely that you do not even get a grave. The timing, 9 years after Billy Bat's murder, suggests the killing was about Billy. 9 years is a long time to wait, but the mob is patient when it comes to revenge. They might have waited for the right moment, the right chance, the right political situation within the families. Or they might have waited simply to make Tommy think he had gotten away with it, making the final revenge even more satisfying. There is a special irony to Tommy's death. He had killed Billy Batts, partly because he could not stand being disrespected, could not stand being reminded of his shoeshine past, could not accept being anything less than feared and respected. In the end, he got his wish. He became a made man. It is just that the making ceremony was his execution. His body has never been found. His family never got to know what happened. He simply disappeared, becoming one more name in the long list of mobsters who vanished without a trace. Jimmy the Gent Burke survived longer, but his life after Billy Bat's murder was not peaceful. In 1978, Jimmy planned the Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport, one of the biggest cash robberies in American history at the time. The heist got them millions of dollars, but it also brought a lot of attention from the police. After Lufthansa, Jimmy killed most of the people involved in the heist to get rid of witnesses and avoid sharing the money. This killing spree made his reputation as a ruthless criminal even stronger, but it also made him a top target for the FBI. Jimmy was eventually found guilty and sentenced to prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. He died in 1996, having never been officially charged with Billy Bat's murder, though by that point, thanks to Henry Hill, everyone knew what he had done. Henry Hill made a different choice. In 1980, facing serious criminal charges and knowing that his life in the mob was basically over, Henry became a witness for the government. He entered the witness protection program and began working with the police. This help was complete. Henry told prosecutors everything he knew about decades of mob activity: murders, robberies, drug deals, corruption. And importantly, he told them about Billy Batts. Henry's testimony gave prosecutors the first detail, inside story of what had happened that night at Robert's Lounge and later at the dog kennel. He described the fight, the beating, the drive upstate, the discovery that Billy was still alive, and the final murder. This was not just valuable on its own. Henry's testimony about Billy Batts was part of a larger pattern of violence that prosecutors used to build cases against. Many mobsters. Each story he told added another piece to the puzzle of how the mob worked, how it settled fights, how little human life mattered when respect and money were involved. Henry's decision to help the police broke the most important rule of La Cosa Nostra, Omerta, the code of silence. by becoming a government witness. He became everything the mob hated: a rat, an informant, a traitor. His testimony would help convict dozens of mobsters and would show the inner workings of organized crime to the public in a way never seen before. But helping the police also saved his life. Dothead Henry stayed in the mob. He almost certainly would have been killed eventually, if not for Billy Bats, then for something else. The mob life, especially by the 1980s, was becoming harder to sustain. RICO prosecutions were destroying the families. Informants were everywhere. The old certainties were falling apart. Henry Hill lived the rest of his life in witness protection, though he had a hard time adjusting. He was arrested several times for different crimes. He had problems with drug abuse. He gave interviews and made appearances, becoming a kind of celebrity in the strange way that mob informants sometimes do in American culture. He died in 2012, having lived longer than both Tommy and Jimmy. Having watched from a distance as the mob world he had been part of slowly fell apart under the pressure of the law and internal betrayals. The story of Billy Bats might have stayed a small detail in mob history. One more unsolved murder among thousands, if not for Henry Hill's help, and what came from it got in 1985. Crime reporter Nicholas Pileggi published Wise Guy, a book based a lot on Henry Hill's testimony and stories. The book was a detailed inside look at mob life, and the murder of Billy Bats was one of its most dramatic moments. Pileggi's story brought the tale to more people, but it was the 1990 movie Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese and based on Pileggi's book, that turned Billy Bats' murder into something everyone knew about. The movie's version of the murder is justly famous. Actor Frank Vincent played Billy Bats, called Billy Bats in the film, keeping the real nickname. Joe Pesci played Tommy DeVito, the character based on Tommy DeSimone. The scene builds up with tension. Billy's jokes about shine boxes, Tommy's barely controlled anger, the sudden explosion of violence. Funny how? Tommy asks in one of the most quoted lines in movie history, forcing Billy to explain why he is funny, turning what seemed like friendly talk into a dangerous situation full of potential disrespect. When Billy finally says, "Go home and get your shine box," Tommy explodes, and the murder happens with shocking meanness. Scorsese's directing makes the scene almost too hard to watch. The violence is sudden, close-up, ugly. There is no glory in it, no heroism. It's just three men beating another man to death in a bar. The normal setting, a typical mob hangout, makes it somehow worse. This is not a dramatic shootout or a fancy execution. It is just murder, raw and real. The film does not ignore what happens after either, showing the characters dealing with the body, the drive upstate, the horrible discovery that Billy is still alive. The scene where they open the trunk and hear him moaning is like a nightmare, made worse because we know this actually happened to a real person. Goodfellas was a success with critics and audiences, nominated for 6 Academy Awards and winning one for Joe Pesci's performance. The film is now considered one of the greatest crime films ever made, often appearing on lists of the best films of all time. And at the center of the film's most memorable part is the murder of Billy Bats. The phrase, "Go get your shine box," became part of popular culture. It became a reference, a way to talk about disrespect and what happens when you insult the wrong person. Younger generations who knew nothing about the real William Bentvena knew about Billy Bats from Goodfellas, but there is an important difference to make here. The film, as great as it is still Hollywood. It shortens timelines, combines characters, and creates dialogue for dramatic effect. The real story has unclear parts and things we do not know for sure that the movie had to make simple. For example, the exact words Billy Batts used to insult Tommy DeSimone are lost to history. Henry Hill remembered the main point of the insult, but might not have remembered the exact words. And even if he did, he was telling the story years later to prosecutors and then to writers, with plenty of time for memory to change. The film also simplifies the mob politics involved, the Gambino family's response, the complicated relationships between families, the years of investigation and revenge. All of this is shortened or left out to focus the story. None of this is a criticism of the film, which is a masterpiece of movie making, but it is worth remembering that the real Billy Batts was a person, not a character. He had a family who missed him. He had friends who remembered him. His murder was not a plot point. It was a tragedy. Billy Batts had children who grew up without their father. He had a wife who became a widow. These people had to live with not just the loss, but also the not knowing, the years of not knowing for sure what had happened, the eventual terrible knowledge of how he died, and why that the mob life that seems so dramatic and exciting in films like Goodfellas was built on this kind of human cost. Every murder left behind greed in families. Every prison sentence meant children growing up with fathers who were not. Their not every act of violence spread out to affect dozens or hundreds of people who never chose this life but suffered its consequences. Anyway, Billy Batts' story became famous. But it is worth asking, would he want this fame? Would he want to be remembered mainly as a murder victim, as the guy who got killed for a shine box comment? Or would he rather be remembered as a father, a husband, a friend, the roles that mattered in real life, even if they do not make for dramatic movies? We cannot answer that question. Billy Batts died in 1970, and he never got to choose how his story would be told, or what his legacy would be. What we can say is that his murder shows basic truths about the mob life. Respect is like money. Violence is always just under the surface. Rules only matter when they are enforced. And the consequences of a moment's anger can last for decades. To truly understand the importance of Billy Batts' murder, we need to understand the rules that control La Cosa Nostra and why those rules existed. The main rule broken here was simple and final. You never kill a made man without clear permission from his family's boss. This was not a suggestion or a guideline. It was law in the mob world, supported by the threat of death for anyone who broke it. Why did this rule exist? Because without it, the mob would destroy itself. Made men had fights all the time over money, over territory, over women, over respect. If every fight could be settled with murder, the families would be in constant internal war. Members would be killing each other faster than they could find new ones. The rule created stability. If you had a problem with a made man, even a made man from another family, you had to go through the right channels. You told your capo, who might tell the underboss, who might bring it to the boss if the problem was serious enough. The bosses would meet and decide on the right action. This process did several things. First, it gave calmer people time to step in. A fight that seems worth killing over in the heat of the moment might seem silly after a few days of thinking. Second, it protected the family's interests. The bosses could think about whether a killing would start a war, whether it would attract police attention, whether it was worth the cost. Third, it kept the order of power. The boss's power came partly from their control over life and death. If anyone could kill anyone, what did being a boss even mean? Tommy DeSimone broke this rule in the most extreme way possible. He was not even a made man himself. He was just an associate, the lowest rank in the mob hierarchy. He killed a made man from another family without permission over a personal insult. It is hard to imagine a more complete breaking of mob rules. Jimmy Burke, who should have known better, went along with it. Maybe he was caught up in Tommy's anger. Maybe he thought they could keep it a secret. Maybe he just did not care about the rules in that moment. Whatever his reason, he became just as guilty. Henry Hill's involvement, while less direct, was still important. He could have refused to take part. He could have tried to stop it. He could have reported it afterward. He did none of these things, making him part of the plan. The rule about not killing made men was not the only rule broken. There was also the bigger rule that you did not bring unneeded trouble to the family. Big deal killings attracted police attention. Killing someone who would obviously be missed, like a made man with connections, led to an investigation. And there was the rule about not mixing family business. Tommy and Jimmy were Lucchese associates. Billy Batts was Gambino family. By killing him, they created a problem between families that could have started a war. The only reason it did not was that the Lucchese leaders eventually admitted they were wrong and allowed for revenge. But perhaps the deepest rule broken was the one about respect and honor. The mob, for all its violence and crime, was proud of a code of honor. You were supposed to be loyal to your friends. You were supposed to keep your word. You were supposed to show respect to those who had earned it. Billy Batts had earned respect. He had become a made man. He had done time without helping the police. He had followed Omerta. Whatever jokes he made at the party, he had earned the right to make them through decades of loyalty to La Cosa Nostra. Tommy DeSimone, on the other hand, had not earned the right to respond with murder. He was not made. He had not proven himself worthy of that status. His reputation was built on uncontrolled violence rather than planned service to the family. The murder of Billy Batts represented the breakdown of the mobs. Internal order. It showed that the rules were not final, that they could be broken if you were willing to accept the consequences. And in the long run, this breakdown would help lead to the mob's decline. As more young mobsters followed Tommy's example, putting personal respect above family loyalty, choosing immediate violence over patient planning, ignoring the rules whenever it was convenient, the mob structure weakened. The old dons who built the families on strict order and rules watched there. Creation fall apart as younger generations proved to be harder and harder to control. The FBI's RICO prosecutions in the 1980s and after would destroy the mob. But the mob was already weakening from the inside, hurt by men like Tommy DeSimone, who cared more about personal pride than about the group's survival. The story of Billy Batts offers lessons that go beyond organized crime. There are lessons about human nature, about the costs of violence, about what happens when systems of order break down. First, there is the lesson about respect and ego. Tommy DeSimone killed Billy Batts because he could not stand being disrespected. This was not about money or power or planning. It was about pride. His ego was so weak that jokes about shining shoes were worth committing murder over. This is an extreme example, but the reason behind it is not only found in mobsters. People make terrible decisions all the time because they cannot stand feeling disrespected. They ruin relationships, destroy careers, even commit crimes, all because someone hurt their ego. The healthy response to insults is to either ignore them if they are meaningless or deal with them fairly if they matter. Tommy's response: murder was so out of proportion that it destroyed his own life along with Billy's. He got 9 more years of life after killing Billy, but he spent those years knowing he was a wanted man, knowing the Gambino family would eventually get revenge. Was that worth it? Did killing Billy Batts actually make Tommy feel respected? Or did it just prove he was exactly the unstable, disrespectful thug Billy's jokes suggested? Second, there is the lesson about the two sides of power and status. Billy Batts was a made man, which gave him power and protection. But it also made him too confident. He assumed the rules would protect him, that his status as a made man meant he could say anything to an associate without consequences. He was wrong. The rules only work when everyone follows them. And Tommy did not care about rules. Billy's confidence that he could not be touched became carelessness. And that carelessness killed him. This happens outside the mob, too. People in positions of power, whether in business, politics, or society, often become too confident. They assume their position protects them, that they can say or do things without consequences because of their status. And sometimes they are right, until suddenly they are not. The rules that seemed final turn out to be flexible. The protections that seemed guaranteed disappear. Third, there is the lesson about the cost of violence. Billy Bat's murder did not just end his life. It destroyed Tommy DeSimone's life. 9 years later, when he was tricked and killed, it helped lead to Jimmy Burke's downfall. He spent his final years in prison. It forced Henry Hill into witness protection, separated from everyone he knew, living under a fake name. And beyond the people directly involved, think of all the other damage. Billy's family lost a husband and father. Tommy's family eventually lost him. The murder created tension between families. It became evidence in future court cases. It spread out in ways none of the people involved could have predicted. Violence is like that. It seems like a simple solution in the moment. Someone disrespects you, you hurt them. Problem solved. But violence creates more problems than it solves. It starts cycles of revenge. It attracts attention from authorities. It traumatizes everyone involved, even the people who do it. The mob understood this in theory. That is why they had rules about when violence was okay. But when the rules broke down, the chaos that followed showed exactly why those rules existed. Fourth, there is the lesson about omerta and the price of silence. For decades, the mob's code of silence protected it from the police. Members went to prison rather than cooperate. They died rather than testify. This loyalty was the mob's greatest strength. But it was also a trap. When Henry Hill finally broke omerta, when he became a witness and told the truth about Billy Bat's and dozens of other crimes, the mob had no defense. Their whole system depended on silence. Once people started talking, the entire structure fell apart. The bigger lesson is about groups built on secrecy and silence. Whether it is organized crime, bad companies, or abuse in institutions, systems that depend on silencing victims and witnesses are naturally weak. They work until they do not. And when they fail in a huge way. Fifth, there is the lesson about prison's role in these stories. Billy Batts did 6 years in federal prison for selling drugs. That prison time did not fix him. He came out and went right back to mob life. But it did take him off the streets during important years, when the younger generation was rising. He missed the rise of Tommy DeSimone. He missed the changing culture of the mob. He came back to a world that had moved on without him. This is often true of being in prison. Whether the person is a mobster or not, long prison sentences remove people from society during key years. They come back to find that friends have moved on. Culture has changed. Chances have disappeared. This does not excuse Billy's crimes. He chose the mob life, chose to deal drugs, and earned his prison sentence. But it does show why prison, as a tool for dealing with crime, is complicated and often fails to do what it is supposed to do. Finally, there is the lesson about the myth versus the reality of mob life. Movies like Goodfellas are exciting because they show the glamour along with the violence, the nice suits, the respect, the friendship, the excitement. Billy Bat's life had moments of that glamour. He was a made man in the Gambino family. He had status and power. But look at what his life was actually made of. Criminal activity, prison, and finally a brutal murder at age 49. Beaten to death and buried in a grave with no marker. His family suffered. His children grew up without him. He spent his last moments awake in terror, locked in a trunk, knowing he was about to die. Where is the glamour in that? Where is the romance? The mob life, without Hollywood's shine, is ugly, brutal, and sad. Let's return to where we started. A car trunk opening in upstate New York, June 1970, showing the body of William Billy Batts Bentvena, from his birth in Brooklyn in the 1920s to his death in 1970. Billy Batts lived the perfect mob life. He started as a kid on the streets, learned the rules, worked his way up, became an associate, earned his button, and became a made man. He dealt drugs even though it was against family rules. He went to prison and kept quiet. He came home to a hero's welcome, and 3 days after he was released, he was murdered for making jokes about shining shoes. The path of his life is almost like a sad Greek play in its irony. He survived 6 years in federal prison, 6 years away from family, 6 years in danger every day from other prisoners, 6 years of staying silent under FBI pressure, 6 years of counting down to freedom. He finally got that freedom on June 9th, 1970. Less than 72 hours later, he was dead. The party that was meant to celebrate his survival became the place of his murder. The status that should have protected him, being a made man, meant nothing against Tommy DeSimone's anger and Jimmy Burke's involvement. The rules he had lived by for decades turned out to be suggestions rather than laws when someone was willing to break them. Billy Batts could not have known that making jokes about shining shoes would cost him his life. By all rights, by all rules of La Cosa Nostra, he should have been safe. Made men did not get killed over insults at parties. That was the whole point of being made. You were untouchable without clear permission from the top. Tommy DeSimone did not care about rules. And Jimmy Burke, who should have stopped it, instead joined in. And Henry Hill, who could have walked away, instead helped get rid of the body. 3 men, in a moment of anger and stupidity, broke every rule of the group they claimed to serve. And the effects of that action spread for years. Tommy DeSimone got 9 more years before the Gambino family took their revenge, tricking him into a fake making ceremony and killing him. He got what he wanted. He was made, sort of. It is just that the ceremony ended with his death instead of his promotion. There is a cruel poetry to that. Jimmy Burke got the Lufthansa heist, got rich, got caught, and spent his final years in prison. All the money in the world could not buy him freedom in the end. He died behind bars, just like Billy Batts had served time behind bars. The difference being that Billy walked out and Jimmy never did. Henry Hill got witness protection, got a new identity, got to live, but he also got separated from everyone he knew, from the culture he had been part of since childhood, from the very identity that had made him who he was. He survived physically, but lost himself in the process. And Billy Batts, in a grave with no marker in upstate New York, got forgotten by everyone except family and friends, and got his story turned into a famous movie scene, 49 years old, just 3 days of freedom, all because he insulted the wrong person. A Gambino family lost a made man, a moneymaker, a loyal member who had proven himself over decades. They lost Billy Batts to the stupidity and violence of young troublemakers from another family who did not understand or respect the rules. Billy's family lost a husband, a father, a son, a brother. They lost him suddenly, violently, for no good reason. They probably spent years not knowing what happened, wondering if he was still alive somewhere, holding out hope even as months and years passed. And when they finally learned the truth, when Henry Hill's testimony made the details public, they had to face the brutal, ugly reality of how he died. There is a line in Goodfellas where Henry Hill thinks about the mob life. As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. The film shows why this dream is appealing. The power, the money, the respect, the feeling of belonging to something bigger than yourself. But it also shows where that dream leads. Prison, death, or witness protection. Those are the only three endings for mobsters. There are no happy endings. No one retires peacefully to Florida. No one grows old surrounded by grandchildren without looking over their shoulder. Billy Bat's story is a warning tale, though not in a simple crime does not pay kind of way. It is more complicated than that. Billy did pay for his crimes. He did 6 years in federal prison. He followed Omerta. He followed the rules, and the rules failed him anyway, because other people did not follow them. So maybe the real lesson is this. Systems built on violence and fear are naturally unstable. They can be kept going for a while through strict order and harsh punishment for breaking rules. But eventually, someone will break the rules. Someone will put personal revenge above the group's stability. Someone will decide that their ego matters more than the system. And when that happens, people die. Not just the guilty, but the innocent too. Not just the people involved, but the families left behind. Not just in the moment, but in the ripple effects that spread for years and decades. Billy Bats walked out of federal prison on June 9, 1970, a free man with his whole life ahead of him. 3 days later, he was beaten to death in a bar for the crime of insulting a young troublemaker who could not control his temper. That is not a story about the glamour of the mob. It is not a story about honor among thieves. It is not even really a story about organized crime. It is a story about what happens when violence is normalized. When respect becomes the only thing that matters. When rules exist but are not followed. When young men value pride over life. It is a human story. Tragically, completely. Sadly human. Billy Bats is buried somewhere in upstate New York. Probably still at that dog kennel or nearby if the body was ever moved. His family likely never got to have a proper funeral, never got to say proper goodbyes, never got to lay him to rest with the dignity every person deserves. Tommy DeSimone is buried somewhere too, or his body was destroyed so completely that there is nothing left to bury. His family also never got closure, never got answers, never got to mourn properly. Jimmy Burke is buried in a marked grave, having died in prison. At least his family had that much. A body, a funeral, a place to visit. Henry Hill is also dead now. Having passed away in 2012. His story was told and retold, his life looked at from every angle. His choices argued about endlessly. And the story of Billy Bats lives on. Made famous in film, endlessly looked at by mob historians and true crime fans. Turned from a real tragedy into a cultural reference. But underneath all the analysis, all the movie quotes, all the fascination with mob history, there was a real man, William Bentvena. Billy Bats, someone's husband, someone's father, someone's friend. He was born in Brooklyn. He grew up during the Depression. He chose the mob life with all its risks and rewards. He committed crimes. He went to prison. He kept the code. He came home, and he died for the unforgivable crime of making jokes about shining shoes. Killed by a young psychopath who cared more about respect than about rules, about pride than about consequences, about ego than about life. That is the complete story of Billy Bats, from his beginnings in Brooklyn to a grave with no marker in upstate New York, from a child of the Depression to a maid, man in the Gambino family. From 6 years in prison to 3 days of freedom to death at 49, a life lived in the Goodfellas, shadows of organized crime, a death that broke every rule of that same organization, a legacy that became a movie scene and a reminder for anyone who needs it that the mob life, for all its myths and romance, always ends the same way, prison, death, or betrayal. Those are the only options. There are no exceptions. There are no happy endings. Billy Batts learned that lesson too late. He paid for that knowledge with his life. If you have made it this far, you have journeyed through the complete story of William Billy Batts Bentvena, a made man who paid the ultimate price for underestimating the wrong person. From his rise through the Gambino family to that fateful welcome home party, his story reminds us that in the world of crime, respect is not just like money. It is survival itself. The real Billy Batts was more than a movie character. He was a complicated person who made choices, some criminal, some loyal, all with big consequences. He lived by a code that, in the end, failed to protect him. He survived. Prison only to die in freedom. He represents both the attraction and the ultimate. Emptiness of the mob life. What surprises people most when they learn the real story is how ordinary it all was. There was no big plan, no fancy mob war, no complicated plot, just a party, an insult, a loss of temper, and a murder that broke every rule of La Cosa Nostra. The fact that it was so ordinary makes it even sadder. The mob world that Billy Batts lived in is mostly gone now. RICO prosecutions, cooperating witnesses, and changing society have taken apart much of the organization that once made La Cosa Nostra so powerful. The days when made men were truly untouchable, when mob bosses could operate almost freely, when the code of omerta was final. Those days ended not long after Billy Batts died in a way. His murder hinted at that ending. The breaking of the rules, the younger generation's disrespect for tradition, the putting of personal fights over family interests. These were signs of a bigger decay that would eventually bring down the entire system. But the human parts of the story are timeless. Pride, violence, revenge, loyalty, betrayal, and the ripple effects of a single moment of anger. These are not just mob traits. They are human traits, shown in an extreme environment where life and death were at stake. Billy Batts deserves to be remembered as more than just a famous murder victim. He was a person who lived a full life. Before that final night, 49 years of experiences, relationships, choices, and consequences. His death was tragic and wrong, no matter what his own criminal activities were. And the lesson his story teaches is not that crime does not pay, though that is certainly part of it. The deeper lesson is about how weak systems built on violence are, about the cost of putting respect above human life, about what happens when rules break down and young men with guns make decisions based on hurt, pride rather than smart thinking. The mob life has always been romanticized in American culture. The suits, the confidence, the feeling of belonging to something powerful and special. These things are appealing. But Billy Batts' story takes away the romance and shows the ugly truth underneath. This is a life that consumes everyone it touches, that destroys families, that ends in graves or prisons or hiding. Billy Batts could not have known when he made those jokes about shining shoes that he was, signing his own death warrant. He believed in the rules that should have protected him. He trusted in his status as a made man. He assumed that decades of loyalty and service to the Gambino family had earned him the right to speak freely among criminals. He was wrong, and he paid for that mistake with everything. So, let's remember Billy Batts not just as the victim in a famous movie scene, but as a reminder of the very real human cost of the mob life. Let's remember that behind every murder, there is a family grieving. Behind every prison sentence, there is a spouse struggling and children growing up without a parent. Behind every famous mob story, there are real people whose lives were permanently damaged by violence and crime. The story of Billy Batts is tragic, not because it is unique, but because it is a good example. Hundreds, maybe thousands of men lived similar lives in organized crime during the 20th century. Most of their names are forgotten. Most of their stories were never told. They died in the streets or in prison or in witness protection, and the world moved on without them. Billy Bat's story was told because Henry Hill became a witness, because Nicholas Pileggi wrote a book, because Martin Scorsese made a masterpiece film. But for every Billy Bats whose story we know, there are countless others whose stories died with them. And all of them, every single one, chose a life that made such endings unavoidable. That is perhaps the saddest part. These were not random victims of bad luck. They were men who chose violence, who chose crime, who chose a path that could only end badly. Billy Bats chose that path. Tommy DeSimone chose that path. Jimmy Burke chose that path. Henry Hill chose that path. And all of them paid prices that, looking back, seemed far too high for whatever rewards the mob life provided. So here is the final lesson. If you live by rules built on violence, you will eventually die by those rules, or by someone breaking them. If you build your identity on respect earned through fear, you will eventually meet someone who does not fear you enough. If you join a group that solves problems with murder, you will eventually become a problem that needs solving. Billy Bats learned these lessons in the worst possible way. He survived 6 years in federal prison, only to die 3 days after getting out. He kept the code of omerta, only to be killed by men who ignored the code that should have protected him. He lived by the mob's rules for decades, only to die when those rules proved to mean nothing. His story is a tragedy in the classic sense. A man brought down by the very system he served, destroyed by the values he followed, killed by the culture he was part of. William Billy Bats Bentvena. Your story has been told, your death is remembered, and the lessons your life teaches still have meaning decades after that. Trunk opened in upstate New York, showing the price of disrespect in a world where violence was always just one insult away. And that is the complete story of William Billy Bats Bentvena, a made man who paid the ultimate price for underestimating the wrong person. From his rise through the Gambino family to that fateful welcome home party, his story reminds us that in the world of crime, respect is not just like money. It is survival itself. If you have made it this far, you are a true mob history fan. Drop a comment and let me know. What surprised you most about Billy Bat's real story compared to the Goodfellas version? And what gangster should I cover next? Do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. We release deep dive stories like this every week. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. If you enjoyed this journey into mob history, give it a thumbs up and share it with anyone who likes these untold stories. Thanks for reading. And remember, these stories are not glamorous. They are warning tales. The mob life always ends one of 3 ways: dead, in prison, or in witness protection. There are no happy endings in this world. Billy Bats survived 6 years in federal prison, only to die after 3 days of freedom. That is not glory. That is tragedy. That is not romance. That is reality. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep exploring the shadows of history.